Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Thank you for downloading and listening to This Pathological Life. If you're interested in continuing the story, we have a second series called This Medical Life. Please download it and subscribe now.
Dr. Travis Brown, why do we need a podcast called This Pathological Life?
Every disease has its own story to tell, so we're going to tell them.
Dr. Travis Brown, in this episode of This Pathological Life, we're talking about a condition, celiac disease, that unlike many of the things we talk about, this one I seem to encounter every time I open a menu at a restaurant.
Yes, it's very common, a lot more common than what we thought it was. And, you know, we now have sort of a weird sort of hybrid now. We have people with celiac disease and people who are gluten intolerant but not celiac, and then we have people who are gluten-free but not, So it is sort of being able to try and work out that divide a little bit.
And there's perhaps unfairly cultural pushback against the people who claim to be more gluten intolerant than they maybe are. Comedians certainly go to town on that, and I'm not sure how helpful that is. And I know that people with celiac disease get quite upset.
Look, it's interesting because what happens is people who genuinely have celiac disease will become incredibly unwell if they eat gluten, whereas some people who will say I'm intolerant can then go and have a bread basket and okay, they're okay,
Yes.
So one of those challenging areas. But look, the interesting thing, as I always like to do, is I want to put some context in this, and our context in this story is actually in September 1939. And the interesting thing is this is when Germany invades Poland. And a bit of a different twist for you there, Steve.
Yes, I've got my finger. I don't know where you're going with this.
So we have...
Except that an army marches on its stomach. Is that a clue?
I have no idea. I don't know that expression.
All right, yeah. So if that stomach is full of bread, that's making them uncomfortable.
Maybe. And so history enthusiasts will know about the politics and everything. So we'll just put it into context. And at that time, World War II was impending. Netherlands was hoping to remain neutral at this time. But we have May of 1940 when Germany turns its interest on France, Belgium, Luxembourg and Netherlands and invades. Now, what ends up happening is Germany is surprised by the resistance, particularly in the Netherlands in this story. 10th of May is when they invaded. And when they're surprised by the resistance, 4 days later, there's what we call the Rotterdam Blitz. Now, the history tells us that Germany was a little bit frustrated by the resistance, and they gave a 2-hour notice to the Dutch army, Winkelmann, that he was going to turn around and say, you're either going to surrender or we're going to level Rotterdam. And at that time, Winkelmann turned around and said, well, please make it official, trying to stall. And then the German commander, the Schmidt, actually turned around and said, okay, but that wasn't relayed to the pilots. And so there was the Rotterdam Blitz, who within 15 minutes on the 14th of May, dropped over 100 tons of bombs. There was fire destruction, over 900 people killed, around 85,000 homes destroyed, and Netherlands ended up actually surrendering the next day. But this is World War II. This is the environment that starts. And what's ended up happening is they began 5 years of Nazi occupation, and it comes with all the atrocities, all the degradation, all the inhumanity of World War II. Dutch people are forced from their homes. They are starved. They're forced to work. The Jewish population, which was around 140,000, up to 160,000 with the mixed marriages at that point in time, are rounded up. And people are registered. And what's ended up happening, as in World War II, about 107,000 Jews are sent off into concentration camps. Those that go there, about 5,200 survive. There was about 25 to 30,000 Jews that go into hiding, assisted by the Dutch underground, and 2/3 of those survive. As the war progresses, though, and this is the part that's relevant for this story, is the resistance increases as war continues. The Dutch people are more and more oppressed, and they're starting to have factories work for the Germans. Every Dutch man between the ages of 18 and 45 is forced to work in the factories for the war machine, the German war machine. And that's a dual problem because they're forced to work and then the Allies are bombing the factories.
Working.
Yeah. And so we then get to 1943 and things are going poorly for the Germans. They're trying to construct the Atlantic Wall, which is a defensive line across multiple countries, more forced labour for Dutch people, and then we have thousands more being displaced already by this construction, and resistance is on the rise. And so with this resistance, there's harsh punishments. And so we know that there's the Dutch government in exile in London, and because of this, in September 1944, they see an impending food crisis for the Dutch people. And so what they end up doing is convincing the Dutch railway workers to strike. Some 30,000 people, 30,000 workers strike. And so that shuts down Dutch area and production. And then
we forget some of the bravery that these people displayed, because it's one thing to strike at any time, but when you've got Nazi overlords and you're striking, that is some degree of gumption.
And that's what I sort of can't get my head around. Like 30,000 workers strike. The problem,
but just like waiting for a train to come, I'm waiting for celiac disease to come. Is it? It's on the horizon.
This sets it up into the next area, and that was the thing. The German military then took control of the railway. The consequence, though, is that the Germans cut off food and fuel transports to the Netherlands. And so this resulted in what's called, not what we know to history as hunger winter, or the winter of hunger. It was 6 weeks of hunger, of food shortages that ended up being initially 6 weeks, but ended up going from November 1944 to the end of the war in May 1945. The harshness of all this and the treatment ended up losing about 20,000 civilian lives, deaths. And this is where we find the story of celiac begins.
All right, and that's coming up on the next station. We'll just pause briefly. We'll be there in a moment.
When I was, with all the times I was pregnant with the children, I was always very anemic, and I could never get on top of that. And about 5 years ago, I was trying to take more exercise to make sure I stayed fit in my old age. And whenever I would do that, my legs would ache a lot. So I went to talk to the doctor about it, and he took my blood and he said, not only are you anemic, but I think you've got an absorption problem. So then I went to the doctor at the hospital in Plymouth, and I had a biopsy done, and it was proved to be celiac. So I was surprised.
Travis, that's a fascinating history in that setup with World War II. But the disease itself, celiac disease, does its history stretch back further than that?
It does. So we have our first description of gastrointestinal problems from Aretaeus of Cappadocia, and he described what we would say today is kilialkas, or after kilia, which is abdomen in Greek, and there is a statement that he wrote.
If the stomach be irretentive of the food, and it passes through undigested and crude, and nothing ascending into the body, we call such persons celiacs?
So celiac is a malabsorption syndrome, even noticed back then, thousands of years. And so it just means these people are having digestive problems, and so they call it celiac disease. Now, we don't see much change in this until 1888, where we get a Dr. Slag. He grouped a segment of enteropathies, so gastroenteritis, symptoms, chronic disease symptoms. He associated, children who have growth inhibition, diarrhoea, and malabsorption, and he called what we end up calling Guy-Herter syndrome, because in 1904 we have Dr. Herter who wrote a book about it, and he classified it as intestinal infantilism. And so they put this together as a Guy-Herter syndrome. So these symptoms were just into this classification.
So the assumption being the intestine just hasn't matured.
Yeah, and the it's unable to take up nutrients, and therefore there's a problem. So this was the category that they fitted into. And so we then have our Dutch paediatrician in 1930s and 1940s, Dr. Willem Dicke. And he had patients who had this Guy-Herter syndrome. So these were patients who are underweight, they're poorly developed, they had anemia, and something that we call steatorrhea, and that's a passing like really fatty stools. It means you're not absorbing fats, and the body is excellent at absorbing fats, and so it won't pass on that. So if you're not absorbing fats, something's really quite wrong. And as William is practicing in 1936 in The Hague, an event happens that captures his attention. Now, when I was going through medical school, there was a pediatric lecturer who said, always listen to the parent or the parents. And this is one of those things where it's as true then as it was way back then.
It was a young mother's statement of her celiac child's rash improving rapidly if she removed bread from the diet that alerted his interest.
And so that statement about a mum's observation about her child stuck with Willem, Dr. Dicke. And what ends up happening is he writes a case study of a young boy that presents to the hospital who's underweight and unwell. He puts him on a strict wheat-free diet. He ends up improving and ended up getting to the point where he discharged. The problem is, every time he went home, he became unwell again. And this happened for 4 cycles. He would go home, get unwell, come to hospital, wheat-free diet, get better, go home. And so was this an isolated incident or not? Was this just this young child that was getting sick and this? And then in 1934 and 1940, the world changed. We have the Dutch under subjugation and conditions deteriorate. And then in 1945, we have the hunger winter. And society, Dutch society, begins to starve. And yet, Dr. Willem Dicke notices that the health of children with celiac disease improves. And so it's a testament to how severe celiac disease can be when starvation without gluten is an improvement to normal life with gluten.
Absolutely.
And so the duration of this hunger winter, because there's no bread, there's no wheat, and these people, the patients actually begin to improve. So you have a whole group of patients now having access to any gluten, and their condition improves. And then, as the Allied planes start to drop food packages that have bread, their condition deteriorates. And so the symptoms return.
If certain types of meal, such as wheat and rye, are replaced in the daily diet, the patient improves. Acute attacks of diarrhoea do not occur, provided these types of meal are not given. After a latent period, which can vary in length, deterioration and acute attacks of diarrhoea reoccur if the objectionable types of meal are added to the diet too soon.
And so after the war's over, he starts to conduct some experiments. They're pretty much gluten challenges or gluten removal. And he narrows down the course. So he knows it's bread, but being able to get it down to gluten takes a few years. And then what we find is a special mention must go to Dr. Mario Scheiner. So he's ended up narrowing it down, saying, I believe it's gluten that's causing all the symptoms that these patients are having. Now, she's a German-British gastroenterologist, and she endoscoped 10 children with these symptoms in the 1950s, end up writing a report in the 1960s, and she found 8 out of 10 of them between the ages of 2 years and 15 years had what you would call celiac disease. It was 4 boys and 4 girls. Now, she ended up going down and doing an endoscope and biopsying the duodenum. And there was some histology that they looked at, which is classic for celiac disease, that she wrote in a report.
Normal villi were not seen in any biopsy specimens from the 8 children with celiac disease. Surface appearances were either flat or showed occasional broad and short villi.
And so they ended up doing some repeat biopsies 5 weeks later, and there was marginal improvement. And then 17 months later, effectively they said this resembles normal mucosa because they had been on a gluten-free diet. And so in all of this, you sit there and just go, what an incredible way of observation from a mother that a doctor noticed, and then they've gone through and said, here is what the body is finding is a problem, and the final word should go to Dr. Willem Dicke.
We have learned in the course of many years' experience in the treatment of celiac disease that it makes a great difference to the patient what kind of starch-containing foodstuffs are included in the diet, in particular whether or not wheat is used. And that's 1953. Well, let's put Dr. Dicke to one side and come back with Dr. Travis Brown in just a moment.
How about a panini?
No, a panini is also a sandwich.
Oh my god, yeah. I never thought of it before, but yes, a panini is a kind of sandwich.
I'll eat it!
So what's the science behind it? Did you just wake up one morning and decide you had it?
No, I went to the doctor and they did, extensive tests.
Oh, well, I don't believe in tests. Too subjective. Too convenient.
How about a wrap?
That is yet another sandwich.
So many things are sandwiches.
If it's a natural occurring thing, then how come we don't see it in dinosaurs?
They didn't have agriculture?
Yeah, so.
So they couldn't grow wheat.
That's just super convenient, isn't it?
I don't think you understand what the word convenient means. I can't share a toaster with people.
We finally arrived to that point in the podcast, Dr. Travis Brown. We will now delve into celiac disease from that pathological viewpoint.
Yeah. So the disease actually is the most common cause of intestinal malabsorption. So it occurs round 1 in 100 or 1 in 200 people, and it's an intolerance to gluten. That's in wheat, it's in barley, it's in rye, less likely to be in oats. But this is a chronic disease that is of long-term intestinal inflammation, and it improves when you remove gluten. So what's actually happening is the body is interpreting gluten as a dangerous product. And so it causes inflammation. It's quite impressive when you think about how they worked out, because you would think that as soon as you put something in your mouth that has gluten, because you can always have bread in your mouth, why doesn't the inflammation actually occur in the mouth or the esophagus or the stomach? And it goes all the way into the duodenum. So it's quite amazing. It's a testament to how they found out that it actually was the duodenum that was the part that's affected. The problem is that's such a large area of absorption. All the villi in the small intestine, if it's all stretched out, can cover the surface area of a tennis court. And so when you've got inflammation going in there, effectively, when you've got that going on, the histology is all those little villi that absorb get so much inflamed, it looks like large bowel. And so you don't absorb anything, and that's why people get the symptoms that they do. And so there's a strong genetic link here. And family members are affected at about 10 to 15%, but half the patients who have celiac disease have an affected sibling. And so there is also an association with autoimmune disease because, again, this is the body recognizing something that isn't a sort of an enemy or something that isn't dangerous as dangerous. And so there's also a predisposing factor of finding other things in the body. And that's type 1 diabetes, autoimmune thyroiditis, and Sjogren's syndrome. And so these patients, so IBS, so inflammatory bowel syndrome, they have people who have celiacs have a 4 times increase of having inflammatory bowel syndrome. And 7% of people with celiac disease fit the classification of IBS. And so they also get, which is something relevant when we talk about testing, is they can get a selective IgA deficiency. And so celiac patients have about a 10 to 15 times increase of having IgA deficiency, and I'll come back to why that's important. So when we're doing typing, genetic testing, we look at what we call HLA types, and that's on the T lymphocytes. And what we end up looking at is there's two predisposing genetic conditions, which is HLA-3. And if a patient has HLA-DQ2, they have a chance of having celiac disease. But it's not a great test. And the reason why it's not a great test is because 15% of the general population have that mutation, and they don't have celiac disease. So the only time that's ever really done is, testing family to see people could have celiac disease that don't do the tests that are a bit more sensitive. And so what do the patients get? Well, the patients get symptoms like anemia. They have nutritional deficiencies, particularly iron and folate. And if it gets really severe, vitamin B12. They have chronic fatigue or weight loss. And then they can get abdominal cramping and diarrhoea, bloating, flatulence, and discomfort. And they can also get osteoporosis because of nutritional loss. And so when we talk about the rash, there's also a rash associated. And this is called dermatitis herpetiformis. And that's what the mother was noticing in 1936.
And that it would clear up when she removed bread from the diet.
That's right. And so what she was noticing was this rash that resolves when gluten is removed. And so we have a few blood tests that are relevant. One's TTG, which is tissue transglutaminase antibody, and another one's called anti-deamidase gliadin antibody. There used to be an older one that I learned when I was going through medical EMA, but we tend not to use that these days. And the reason is with regards to the IgA and IgG is because that's the immunoglobulin that's created, and most of the tests are IgA. The problem is celiac disease can have IgA deficiency. So if that happens, it will test negative, but not because they're not celiac, it's because they don't have IgA. Right. And so often we'll do an IgG associated test with those. And so they are also useful to see if people are on a celiac diet, to see if they're sometimes you can actually get contamination accidentally that you didn't know, and you can have the symptoms thinking you're having a gluten-free diet when you're actually not.
In fact, a good friend of mine who is celiac sees a restaurant say we're gluten-free, but she has to do thorough research because a minor bit of contamination. Yeah,
well, my mother's celiac, and so the interesting thing is you will eat a product thinking it's fine because it's gone gluten-free, but sometimes they'll change the recipe and you didn't know that the recipe's changed, and then you get symptoms. And so this is where, gluten-free isn't necessarily gluten-free. And so the whole thing is sometimes you can have these tests to say, the DGP is useful and a little bit more dynamic. So you can have these blood tests and say, if there's no antibodies there, then you're most likely gluten-free is consistent. But there's no guidelines to say how often you do this. If you want, as a rule of thumb, people sort of tend to do them every 6 months if they're wanting to keep an eye on it. But the whole point behind that is that the gold standard of all this is a duodenal biopsy, gastroscope. And so that will tell us, do you have celiac disease or not? Are those villi blunt? Do you have inflammation that's going on with that?
What leads a GP to ask for that?
That will be if you're either equivocating on the results, or someone's on a gluten-free diet and you're not quite sure and definitely doesn't, or you actually just need to find out, do they have celiac disease? So the whole thing behind that is is there false negatives? Yeah, there are. Even with the gastroscope, is because if they've got really extensive disease, any biopsy you're going to take is, going to show it. If you've got patchy disease, inflammation in certain areas, you might miss it just on the biopsy. So it just depends. Sometimes it can be something that's missed if it's a subtle presentation. And then what we have, it's important to note that a gluten-free diet isn't a good test in itself. So if someone feels better on a gluten-free diet, it's not necessarily because they're celiac, because we know that patients who have inflammatory bowel syndrome often report feeling better on a gluten-free diet. But we know 25% of people who have celiac disease will not feel better on a gluten-free diet, even though the inflammation is better in their duodenum. So the gluten-free diet in itself is not a good test. It's not a good clinical examination to work out, does this patient have celiac? Right. And the important thing to note is the villi will start to recover within weeks to months, but the antibodies will stay around for about 3 to 6 months. So they'll still be about that time, which is why it's a good test if someone's been on a gluten-free diet for a long time, that you can do the blood test and hopefully the antibodies aren't there. That being said, you know, if 2 months in, well, they're probably going to be antibodies already still about. So you can't monitor it in a short-term way. And so the whole point behind this is it's an incredible story about celiac disease that shows a doctor listening to a patient or a patient's mother is saying, I think this is what's going on. And unfortunately, war that proved it correct.
Thank you, Dr. Travis Brown, for that, and also for clearing up the term IgA deficiency. I always thought it was only when you had Coles and Woolies around you. Now I know better.
Very good. And that's it.
This Pathological Life is produced by ClinPath Pathology in South Australia. Episode notes, references and learning objectives, when applicable, can be found at thispathologicallife.com.au. And you can contact the hosts on Twitter via @Dr. Travis Brown or @Steve Davis. Thanks again for listening, and just a reminder, if you haven't done it yet, have a quick search in your podcast app for our second series, This Medical Life. Dr. Travis Brown has rolled up some extra guests, some extra topics, and we continue the story there, and we'd love to have you along.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.